Good evening. This is Wednesday, January 14th, 6 days until the inauguration of President-elect Barack Obama. And virtually everything Mr. Obama must undo starting next Tuesday, President Bush did in the name of 9/11. We had to shred the Constitution for 9/11. We had to become torturers for 9/11 to prevent another one, to ensure justice for those behind 9/11 itself. And tonight in our fifth story, on the eve of Mr. Bush's last fevered attempt at legacy rewriting, tonight we know for sure not only that Mr. Bush's decision to torture merited that word, we know it now from a Bush official. We also know that it has denied this nation, the victims of 9/11 and their loved ones, the chance to see some justice done for that awful day. Susan Crawford is the top official in charge of whether detainees at Guantanamo Bay actually go to trial. Last May, she dropped the charges against Mohammed al-Qahtani, a Saudi accused of being the potential 20th hijacker. Qahtani tried to get into the U.S. on August 4th, 2001, but was turned back at Orlando International Airport by a suspicious immigration agent after Qahtani refused to say who was meeting him. The Pentagon says it was supposed to be Mohammed Atta, that Qahtani was meant to fly on board United number 93, which instead only had 4 hijackers, 4 who failed to overcome the rebellion by the passengers. Today, Ms. Crawford has explained why she dropped the charges, why she told prosecutors she will never let them prosecute him. Quote, "We tortured Qahtani." Crawford, a lifelong Republican appointed by Defense Secretary Gates, breaking her silence to the Washington Post. Quote, "His treatment met the legal definition of torture, and that's why I did not refer the case." In addition to the psychological abuse later authorized for use at Abu Ghraib, Qahtani experienced 18 to 20-hour interrogations for 48 out of 54 consecutive days, was deprived of sleep, was exposed to extreme cold for prolonged periods, all of which left him in what Crawford called a life-threatening condition. Techniques, Crawford says, were authorized by the then Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. At one point, Qahtani's heartbeat dropped to 35 beats per minute. He claims he is innocent. He has recanted a coerced confession. And if Qahtani is guilty, the 9/11 widows and families have now been denied by Mr. Bush the very justice that he claimed in their name warranted his sprint to abandon centuries of American principle. Quoting Crawford again, speaking of Mr. Bush, "I think he hurt his own effort. I think someone should acknowledge that mistakes were made and that they hurt the effort and take responsibility for it." Mr. Bush's failure to bring justice to the killers of 9/11, to fulfill his vow that they would hear us soon, brought home just as powerfully today by the man behind 9/11 by a new tape from a voice U.S. officials do not dispute belongs to Osama bin Laden, talking about Gaza, the dilemmas Mr. Bush leaves Mr. Obama. Senior intelligence officials telling NBC News the tape was time to, quote, taunt Bush at the end of his presidency on his failed pledge to get bin Laden, quote, dead or alive. We're joined again now by criminal defense attorney Charles Swift. As a lieutenant commander in the JAG Corps, he successfully challenged one of Mr. Bush's first made-up military justice systems in the landmark Supreme Court case, Hamdan v. Rumsfeld. Welcome back to the program, sir.
Thanks for having me back, Keith. It's great to be back.
Your reaction to Crawford's interview, especially in light of the fact that she is still the person in charge of prosecuting and deciding which of these Gitmo cases goes to trial?
Well, I'm surprised in that she's taken this stand at this point. I'm not at all in disagreement with her conclusion. I think that's something that the Qahtani was subject to torture is something that's been known by the military for quite some time. In fact, Stuart Couch, who was originally charged with prosecuting Mr. Qahtani, quit in 2006, citing the torture in the case. And I believe that probably the political situation has shifted such that even the administration's strongest supporters can no longer claim that he was not tortured.
Besides the fact that somebody still serving technically in this administration has used that term, has said, we tortured, perhaps the headline in this, or the sub-headline would be that she said that there were no individual technique was used on Qahtani, but that the combination and the frequency and the duration and the intensity rose, or if you prefer, sank to the level of torture. The meaningfulness of her pointing that out.
Simple part. I think most of us who've had involvement with Guantanamo Bay point out that it's the death of 1,000 cuts, a famous Chinese torture. It's no one thing, it's everything. And it's the combination with which it's done and the period of time with which it's done. It's not that you've not slept for 24 hours, it's that you haven't slept for 30 days. It's not that you were exposed to the cold for 20 minutes, it's that it was for hours on end, maybe for 10 days, etc. And when all those things come together, they can kill an individual, they can drive an individual mad. And they are absolutely torture. And so, once again, when one looked at the interrogation techniques that were being put together, I think it was always a propaganda part, that we could publish all of this and say, well, none of this is that bad, without looking at the absolute overall effects. But, you know, it's in almost every case that's going on down there, Keith. The Jawad case, the young man, the young Afghani who's accused of throwing a grenade, you know, he was subject to sleep deprivation for 22 days, enough to kill him. The military judge found that that was torture, yet the administration still appeals it and still is arguing that no. So for me, the biggest story today is this is the first administration official in charge of prosecutions ever to admit it, to say flat out, well, that's torture. But it's not like that's in the only case.
Those who don't have ethical or legal qualms with the idea of torture, or if they like to clean up the language and call it enhanced interrogation, should they have a newer sense tonight with what Crawford said of just the practical qualms that we've already heard that it doesn't work, it doesn't produce bona fide information, and now we're finding out that it may cripple investigations and let perhaps horrible, heinous criminals free?
It has 3 absolute kills. Of course, the system, the use of torture jeopardizes your ability to prosecute someone. It jeopardizes, and the reason it does is not some higher that if we do this, then they're absolved. The reason it does is it produces unreliable information. It's a taint that taints everything. And as Judge Crawford's pointed out in that same article, this taint, and she is well aware, has grown to the point that it has contaminated everything Guantanamo and everything military commissions.
Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift, on an epic night for our understanding of the last few years of this horrible story. Thank you as ever for your time tonight, sir.
No problem, Keith.